I'm Jim Newman, and I've lived in Dune Acres since 1965. Before that, my wife Mary Alice and I lived in Hyde Park, and we were on the staff at the University of Chicago and living in a small apartment. And actually in 1960, we came out and bought a weekend house. Dune Acres was established in 1923. It came about, I suppose, because of a conjunction of circumstances. In the first place, it became accessible. Up until about 1900 or so was pretty much a big swamp and densely wooded dunes, and access was really very difficult except by water. But then came the railroads, first the South Shore, and then the big event was the building of Highway 12. I think a very significant and to me very interesting change was a change in attitude towards nature, which takes place all over the United States, and in fact in Britain, about 1880, 1890, 1900, when people no longer just looked or saw the outdoors from indoors, so to speak, but wanted to get out into it. It's interesting, I think, that the Impressionist painters in France, for example, were the first group of painters that went outside, that didn't do studio work. Nature lovers were coming out to the dunes and finding it to be beautiful and full of rare plants and animals, and I think that combination of that new wanting to be a part of nature, plus accessibility, plus the fact that there were towns growing in the area, all came together to make this a logical place for a town. The site was here and it was accessible, but it took somebody to realize the potentialities, and that person was William Wirt, who was the superintendent of the Gary schools. And he was a remarkable man. He was a real innovator, a very clever, creative man, and set up a system in Gary that became known throughout the country. But he was also a businessman. Rather unusually, he was the president of a bank in Gary and had a lot of interest in real estate development. Well, so he and some other Gary businessmen, all of whom were young and enthusiastic, came together to form what they called Dune Acres Incorporated, and they were the ones that started the town. When this land became available, came on the market, originally it had been intended to be part of a large state park, but in the event in, I think, about 1922 or 23, the state decided not to have an 8-mile stretch of beach along this water, but to use only half of that or so. And so the rest was open for sale, and Wirt and his friends bought it. That group of men were fortunate in having among them Colonel A.P. Melton, who was a town planner, one of the early town planners in America. He had laid out the city of Gary, and he did other work elsewhere. And he's the one who laid out Dune Acres. And we were very fortunate because he didn't try to make it a town with a grid pattern, which was so common. He allowed the roads to wander around the hills and up the sides of the dunes, and to leave as much of nature as possible. The roads really nestle into the terrain. So he did a good job.
I am Mary Ann Tittle, doing an interview with Ruth Ray Bremner, who is the daughter of the Rays of Porter Beach. I asked Ruth about the first little house in 1921.
And it had canvas striped awnings that went up and down for the walls, and it was screened also. And it had a roof and a floor, and he built it for my mother so they could honeymoon. And we were over here in what is now State Park at that time. But however, when the State Park took it over, my father did not do a lease back or that kind of thing. He rented a little house, which was at the foot of this blowout. It was a little cottage type place, and he took his portable house down and brought it over there and put it up next to the little cottage that he was renting, and he and my mother used that for their bedroom. In 1929, the storm came in and washed that little house out, and all that was left was the stand for the pump. Even the pump was gone. But my mother was an artist, and she didn't like the looks of that little cottage, so she got permission from the owner to paint it, and she painted it lavender. And for years after 1929, all up and down the beach, we would find lavender boards.
What you could call the bones of the place, I think the structure of the town was established right from the beginning. The clubhouse, the guest house, down on the beach, the marina, and interesting, I think, is the fact there was a golf course. They had a complicated task. They had to build roads in. Building houses, the early houses, was not easy. All the material had to be brought in across the swamp. The roads had to be built from materials brought in from across the swamp. And it was a major kind of engineering problem to get the town laid out. All that was done by Alden Studebaker, who was Wirt's nephew. Actually, he was Wirt's wife's nephew. He actually built the roads and all of the houses that were built, almost all of the houses that were built before the war.
I had the pleasure of interviewing Henry and Arthur Studebaker. Henry told me how their father got to Dune Acres.
He arrived out here on Armistice Day, 1924, on his Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Came up here to the clubhouse. And this is where he lived for quite some time, until he got his own house built over on 32 Crest Drive. Well, they got a few houses started before the Depression came. Quite a few of them, in fact. One of them was William Wirt's house, which burned down sometime after that, and several others. The owner and editor of the Gary Post-Tribune, Burgess Snyder, built a house. That was in 1927. And of course, Mr. Leary's house was built in 1927. And I think the Rossman's house, who was a teacher in the Gary schools, it was a log house built right across from Charlie Leary's house. These were both on Crest Drive.
Almost all of the early houses were log houses. It would be interesting to know how that happened. You know, why they thought of building log houses. I don't know. The clubhouse and the guest house had been built of logs, and they are very reminiscent to me of the lodges that were built in the national parks in the West, in the Black Hills and in Yellowstone, and also in the Adirondacks. And I expect maybe that was kind of the idea of what a resort in the woods should be like. And then the log houses probably just kind of naturally fell in with that. The motor power, so to speak, for doing all of this heavy, heavy work was provided by horses. Well, they had built the clubhouse and they had built the guest house and the other facilities, and then lots were sold. And of course, all the men who formed the corporation bought a lot and got the choicest sites. William Wirt had a house at the corner of East Road and Beach Road, which has since burnt down. Harry Hall's house was on Shore Drive. Colonel Melton, as I remember, had a house next to Harry Hall's. It was the lots on the lake shore that sold first. Only with the Depression, when things were pretty tight, did the less expensive lots, which were back from the water, begin to sell. The corporation itself had a hard time, and I think, well, you can see that in the fact that the golf course could not be maintained, and slowly it kind of reverted to nature. You can still see some of the greens. You can pick out where the greens were in one or two places down there still, but it all went out of use in the Depression. And one thing is that they'd had electric lights, poles on the streets originally, but the taxes weren't enough to pay for the public lighting. And so there was a long, if you follow the town records, there was long negotiations with the public utility about the big bill we were running up. And finally, the lights were turned off, and they never were turned on again. We don't have street lights in Dune Acres.
My name is Margaret Doyle, and I've lived in Dune Acres most of the time since 1953. The house was built, I understand, about 1937 or 38, and we moved here, as I said, in 1953. And I had a friend who had just bought a lot in Dune Acres, and I came out with her to see the lot, and I looked at the house, and I said, I don't know whether I should tell my husband about this house or not, because I know it's one that he thinks we should buy, and I didn't see how we could afford such an expensive house at that time. And of course, it really didn't cost much at all then, but he did come out, and we did buy it, and we've enjoyed all the time we spent in Dune Acres. And this is the last of the log houses to be built. There are, I think, about 10 or 12 log houses altogether, and this is the last one. The house was built by Jack Knight. That is to say, he was the owner of the house, and he had Alden Studebaker was the designer and the builder of the house, and Oscar Nelson did all the stonework around the house. So it's a real Dune Acres house. This lot is quite small, but and their houses nearby are quite nearby, but because of the contours of the land, we're not really conscious of our neighbors much at all. And the blowout out there, back of us, when we first moved here, there's very little vegetation out there. And the dune was still a moving dune, and it was just clear sand. And nothing had grown on it. It had not been stabilized in any way. and it was beautiful. It was something that you just don't see under ordinary circumstances.
This is the site of where our father built a concrete block manufacturing plant in the late 1930s, around about 1937.
About 36, 37, I believe.
Prior to that, the concrete blocks had been made a few hundred yards over here on a hand machine, and this was a mechanized operation. He went up to Holland, Michigan, and bought the machine up there, and they brought it down here and set it up in here along with the concrete mixers it took to mix the concrete with machinery rather than by hand, which had been done previously. And the concrete block machine could make 2 blocks a minute. Initially, all of the aggregate that was used in the blocks was hauled off of the beach down in front of the town. And they had a tractor and a trailer. They'd go down there and scoop up the gravel, bring it back up here, and didn't we shovel that all through screens? Screen the big stones out of it?
Screen.
And
They made the finest blocks.
They made very tough blocks. Nice looking blocks, but that wasn't too practical sometimes, and that was very manpower intensive. So in the early 1940s, we started using limestone from the Thornton Quarry to make the concrete blocks. And we spent many, many hours driving back and forth to Thornton, hauling aggregate out here, 5 tons at a time, in our old Ford dump truck. That one was made with lake gravel.
Yeah, we could make all sizes. We made 4-inch, 6-inch, 8-inch, 10-inch, 12-inch, and rock face and smooth face, and some very fancy
Stucco face. After school, we'd come over here, and the 3 of us, Arthur, myself, and our father, would, in an evening's time, we could make a couple hundred blocks. Went into building the houses in Dune Acres, and they also, all over the county and several schools were built with those concrete blocks. Hebron School was made with those blocks.
Clouds. The auto dealerships in Valparaiso, many of them were built.
And a whole subdivision over in Michigan City has all the basements were built with block.
Perhaps the most influential man in the history of early Dune Acres, at least, after William Wirt and his friends, was Burgess Snyder. He was the owner of the Gary Post-Tribune and a very influential person. He gradually became a major owner of Dune Acres Incorporated and helped it through the Depression. 2 or 3 interesting things about Mr. Snyder. First of all, when he came to build a house, he did not build a log cabin. Instead, he built the kind of house that was being designed by Meisner in Palm Beach in Florida. He built a kind of a modified Mediterranean house with red tile roof. And his brother-in-law built another right next to him. He was unmarried when he came here and did not marry until he was early middle age, when he went to a newspaper publishers convention in New York, and there he met Mary Reynolds. She was the literary editor of the New York World. And they had a whirlwind romance and over the weekend, and were married on Monday of that weekend at the home of, I think his name was Roy Howard, who was the owner of the Scripps Howard papers for which she had worked. So Mary Snyder came to Dune Acres and was an outstanding personality in town. They had a son, B.G., who is one of the second generation people who, of whom there are a number, who have houses now in Dune Acres. A third interesting thing about Burgess Snyder is that that he is responsible for, to some extent at least, for our water system. There had been a well drilled on Clubhouse Hill to service people around, but it was inadequate. And in the 1930s, he used his influence to get the WPA to come in as a government-sponsored project and put in a second well, which made the water supply much more dependable for at least for the East End. And then in 1965, the whole system was upgraded when our present well was built. And it's been upgraded since then again, of course. The reservoir must have been put in very early because it was under the guest house, which was built in 1924. The guest house itself is an interesting phenomenon. It was operated in conjunction with the clubhouse. The guest house itself was torn down after the war. It had been so badly neglected when supplies were unavailable during the war that it couldn't really be brought up to snuff again. So it was torn down then. But in its heyday of the 20s and 30s and during the war, it was very popular during the war, it was a central feature of Dune Acres life. Meals were available in the clubhouse on the first floor, and then there was a large gathering area on the second floor, and the third floor was a recreation room with a shuffleboard court laid out on the floor.
The main thing that I remember about the meals, that they were really nice and served on checked tablecloths, and little maids served the dinner. And then after dinner, they had the little mints that looked like little marshmallows. Yeah, that's my biggest recollection of those meals, but they were good. My dad thought they were swell, and my mother. And so we did that a number of times. We stayed here at the clubhouse. And I also remember once walking down to the beach with my father when it was still too cold to go swimming, which was a terrible disappointment. And then I was exhausted coming back out, because I was pretty young then. Several people came and built here at the recommendation of my parents. One was, the first one was George Smith. Oh. And they had a little cottage on Porter Beach, and when it was sold, my mother persuaded them that they really needed to have a house in Dune Acres. And so they did. And then Ed McEwen was my father's attorney, and he came to Dune Acres. We had some great experiences here, and one of the most outstanding ones was the time that they had about a 2-week seminar here, and Dr. Cowles himself came for that seminar.
Was it held at the clubhouse?
And it was held at the clubhouse, and they did allow children to come, provided that they behaved themselves. So my brother and I came to that seminar, and that was really an eye-opener for me. It made me appreciate more than just the beach and the swimming and the sand and so on, which had been my main interest. But I remember being very impressed by the fact that there were things that grew here that then didn't grow anyplace else, except maybe the cactus grew here and in the Southwest, but no place else. And it was really a wonderful thing that they did then. Because my father was from Boston and my mother was from Buena Vista, Colorado. And they were working in Chicago, both of them, and met there. And my father wanted to have someplace to go for weekends. They were told that the place to go was Lake Geneva. One Saturday morning, they went over and were going to get on the train at Lake Geneva, and so was everybody else in Chicago. And my father said, if everybody's going there, I don't think that's where I want to go. And so he said, you know, my friend Dan told me about a place the other way that's on Lake Michigan in Indiana, and it's a new train. And why don't we try that? So they went back across the loop, and the South Shore train had just started running recently. And so they got on that train, and they said they wanted to get off at the dunes. So they were let off at Tremont, and there was a horse and wagon there. And you climbed up on the wagon, and the wagon took you down to what is now State Park.
Well, here we are at the guest book, and we just found the first time they came out was January 1st, 1927. And then they came out every month. Ruth was, it even says, Ruth Frances Ray, 3.5 years old. And they're just up and down about every 4 lines. Mr. and Mrs. William Ray and Ruth Frances Ray.
They came from all over, but especially they came from Chicago. And when my wife and I moved out here in the 60s, there was a cohesive group of people who were at that point in, I suppose, in their early 50s or so, who had been coming out to the inn all during the 30s and during the war. And when the inn was no longer possible, they bought lots and they built houses, and many of them moved out here permanently. And they were a interesting and lively group that we all remember with affection. One of the significant events in Dune Acres history came about in the period after the war, not very long after the war. Wirt and his associates had an option to buy all the land that along the lakeshore for a mile or so, but they didn't exercise that option. And so the original town was much more restricted in its size than today. There was a crisis because the man who owned the property south, as far between East Road and the Gatehouse, where the Gatehouse is now, and also who owned the lakeshore area, came up for sale. And it was a very expensive, he wanted $50,000 for it, which at that time, you know, was worth, what, $500,000 probably? There was a real danger that it would be bought for development by someone who would not maintain the spirit of Dune Acres. A committee was formed of citizens who worked with the town government. Collectively, they raised the money from the property owners in Dune Acres to buy that. What they did was they went through, with permission, the tax rolls and how much each property was assessed for, and that person, that property was assessed a portion of the $50,000, and through that they raised almost enough, and then a couple individuals came in to fill up the gap, and the owner came down a little bit, but at any rate, that is called the Elmore property. Importance of that, of course, is immense, because that is where the playgrounds now stand, and it extended the town boundary down to the beginning of the swamp. Well, hardly had that been a major task of fundraising been accomplished when another parcel of land came up on the opposite side of Mineral Springs Road and running again from what is now West Road down to the swamp. And the owner of that wanted a considerable sum of money And there was grief and despair all over, because how in the world would they be able to raise that much more money after having raised what amounted to, as I say, about $500,000 already. But somebody had the bright idea of selling off a portion of the previous purchase, the Elmore purchase, for building lots, and that was done, and the profit or the income from that, the results of that, were sufficient to buy the land on the other side of Mineral Springs. There were many more trees and woods in our area at that point, because it was before Bethlehem Steel had been built and so forth. And brush fires and little forest fires were fairly common. But in 1949, there was a major fire.
There was a big fire started out here on US 12 alongside of just south of the railroad tracks, and a March wind blew that fire right through to Dune Acres here, and burned this whole block plant down to the ground and everything that was in it, along with one of the houses over here on Crest Drive.
Albert Furch's house.
Yeah, Mr. Albert Furch's house burned to the ground in that fire. And it burned all the way to the lake down in front of Crest Drive. And burned quite a ways through the town and other areas, but they were able to save all the other homes from that fire.
We built a backfire in that ravine and burned back over it. And you see that whole area where my old Kuhn's house is, that's all woods up in there. Between our house and theirs, it's just a big hill of woods. The clubhouse caught on fire.
They got that
and they
out,
put it out. It's an unbelievable fire. There was no stopping it. It was just arcing. It went on all day.
Yeah.
But people were out with hoses.
Yeah.
The fire would have gone by, but there'd be trees burning. So people would go back in with the firefighters and try to put out those trees that were burning.
And that was kind of where it all ended up after that. We spent about a year hauling the junk out of here. And all that's left is what you see, the slag.
These things could become kind of sociable events if it wasn't serious, not a very serious fire. I can remember standing down along Coles Bach with a beater and having a very sociable conversation with 2 or 3 of the neighbors as we worked at it. All of that, I think, leads me to one of the most important points I think that can be made about Dune Acres, and that is there is this spirit of being part of a community and contributing to the community. You see that in the fundraising events, you see it in the social program, you see it in the way we fought fires at that time. The decades that passed from after the 1940s and 50s, numerous projects came up that had where public fundraising was required. We were lucky in the 1980s, 70s and 80s, to have a man called Jim Hopper living here. He was a dean in the University of Chicago Business School and in charge of development there, and had some knowledge of areas in which a foundation had been started to assist the town in ways that the town could not finance. And he worked with Mary Ann Tittle, his neighbor, and an enthusiastic neighbor, and they organized the Dune Acres Civic Improvement Foundation, established with the approval of and help of the town board. It has had many major projects. Perhaps the most important of them was the renovation of the clubhouse. The clubhouse had well. Some of the logs were rotting, the windows were in bad shape, and the kitchen was primitive. We were very fortunate to have a contractor that was familiar with historical preservation. They were, the contractor and his men were Amish. They came from an Amish community in eastern Indiana. They all had long beards, and nobody talked. The town itself then paid for the actual reconstruction, but there were two very expensive parts of it that had to be done privately. One was the renovation of the kitchen, and money for that was provided by the social committee, and which led to putting in a very high quality, modern kitchen. But the other problem was the windows. All the windows had to be restored. The foundation issued an invitation to residents to pick out one of the windows that would go in and pay for it, and then that family's name or that individual's name would be marked on the window itself. Well, all this was culminated in a marvelous celebration at Christmas time in 1991 with a musical program with Mary Stolper, to which everybody in town came, and they were invited to come and say hello to their windows. So we had a big crowd, and it was a lot of fun. And it started another Dune Acres tradition with different programs, but always with a large attendance. Finally, I think that it should be said that Dune Acres has probably preserved the dunes and our natural environment, because the people who live here have made some sacrifice to keep it as it is. So I think we can be proud of Dune Acres.